Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly past the guards and into a candlelit bedchamber where the air smells faintly of beeswax and old roses, and you are already awake, staring at silk curtains stitched with symbols of power you never chose. The crown rests nearby, heavy even when it is not on your head, and you probably won't survive this emotionally intact because tonight is about the thoughts queens are never meant to finish, let alone speak aloud. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and local time in the comments because insomnia loves company. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie awake as queens historically did behind thick curtains meant to keep out drafts, spies, and inconvenient emotions, and you discover that none of them are very effective against the human heart. You are married, yes, in the official public, embroidered sense of the word, joined by a ceremony that once echoed through stone halls and smelled strongly of incense and political compromise. This is a mainstream historical fact. Royal marriages were treaties with eyelashes, contracts sealed with rings, and everyone involved knew it except perhaps the very young people standing at the altar. You remember standing there, smiling until your cheeks hurt, while men with maps congratulated one another as if you were a newly signed document. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a quieter voice already knew love would not follow instructions. Tonight, that voice is louder. You stare at the ceiling and admit, silently at first, that you are in love inconveniently, catastrophically, and with someone history would later reduce to a footnote or erase entirely. You confess it to the darkness because the darkness cannot report you. This feels safe, or at least safer than daylight, which has a habit of turning private feelings into public disasters. Your hands rest on your stomach, a grounding trick you learned from ladies in waiting who pretended not to notice your restlessness. Quirky tidbit: some queens kept live songbirds in their chambers at night, believing the soft movement calmed anxious thoughts, which is either medieval mindfulness or proof that humans have always tried everything except sleeping. You think back to how carefully your life was choreographed, how even your bedtime had witnesses, and how love was never penciled into the schedule. The crown promised stability, continuity, and a very nice collection of jewels, but it never promised warmth. You were taught that affection could be learned like a language if you practiced long enough. Historians still argue whether queens truly accepted this belief or merely pretended to for survival, and you suspect the truth sits somewhere uncomfortable in between. You practiced dutiful smiles the way other people practice scales on a piano, and you got very good at it. Gold stars all around except for the small, persistent ache that followed you back to your rooms each night. Your forbidden love begins, as these things so often do, with something embarrassingly small. A look held for half a second too long. A laugh you weren't supposed to hear. If this were a modern rom-com, there would be a meet-cute involving spilled coffee, but instead it's a formal audience and a misjudged glance. You replay it now, over and over, like a song stuck in your head at 3 a.m. You tell yourself it meant nothing, which is a lie you deliver with impressive confidence. Somewhere in the palace, a clock ticks, reminding you that time moves forward whether you are ready or not, which is frankly rude. You shift beneath embroidered sheets and think about how the palace smells different at night, less like politics and more like dust and wax and human fatigue. This is when you feel most like yourself, stripped of ceremony, just a person with a pulse and a problem. You consider praying because that's what you're supposed to do, but prayer tonight feels dangerously close to honesty. Instead, you whisper your confession inwardly, shaping the words without sound. You love him, or her, or them, and loving feels like standing at the edge of something deep and cold and strangely inviting. There's humor even here, because the universe has a sense of timing that borders on sarcasm. Of all the people in all the kingdoms, you fall for the one person who complicates everything. Very on brand for history, honestly. You almost laugh, a quiet, breathless sound swallowed by curtains, and you imagine future scholars debating whether this love was reckless passion or quiet rebellion. You wish you could tell them it was mostly exhaustion mixed with hope, but footnotes rarely allow for that kind of nuance. As the night stretches on, you realize this is only the first confession. Not the last, not the worst, just the first crack in a very polished surface. You don't yet know where this love will take you, only that it has already taken root, and roots are notoriously difficult to remove without breaking something important. You close your eyes, not to sleep, but to hold the feeling steady, knowing dawn will demand the crown again. Morning arrives without asking your permission, pale light seeping through the same silk curtains that guarded your thoughts only hours ago. You rise because queens always rise, because entire households depend on the sound of your feet touching the floor. Servants help dress you in layers of fabric chosen for symbolism rather than comfort. And as they lace and pin and smooth, you think about how marriage was wrapped around you in much the same way. This is another mainstream historical fact that no one bothers to soften. Royal marriages were negotiated years in advance, often when the bride was still learning how to write her name properly. Love, if it arrived at all, was expected to show up later, like an uninvited guest who might eventually behave. You remember the negotiations as a blur of adult voices and serious faces, of words like alliance and border and dowry floating above your head while you focused on not fidgeting. You were praised for your composure, which is code for you did not cry in public, and that became the first skill you truly mastered. When the marriage was announced, bells rang and people cheered, and you smiled because smiling was the correct response to destiny being decided for you. Somewhere deep inside, a quieter you took notes. You would need them later. Walking now through corridors that echo with your footsteps, you recall how quickly your body learned the routine of duty. Stand here. Bow there. Speak when spoken to. Queenship is muscle memory layered over a personality that doesn't get much exercise. You pass tapestries depicting idealized romances of gods and heroes, which feels like a practical joke hung in wool. The irony doesn't escape you, even if everyone else pretends it does. Quirky tidbit. Some queens reportedly used these very tapestries as memory aids, associating certain corridors with certain tasks. A medieval version of sticky notes, except much harder to rearrange. Your husband waits in a chamber heavy with official scent, leather, ink, and authority. He's not cruel, which almost makes things harder. History loves clear villains, but reality prefers awkward silences and mutual misunderstanding. You exchange polite words, a practiced duet you've both memorized, and you think about how affection was supposed to grow from familiarity. Historians still argue whether political marriages ever stood a real chance at genuine intimacy, or whether the power imbalance doomed them from the start. You suspect the answer depends on how generous one is feeling toward humanity that day. As the meeting drags on, your thoughts wander, traitorously, to the person you are not supposed to think about. Love has a way of inserting itself into the most inappropriate moments, like a cat walking across a keyboard during an important email. You correct your posture, nod at the right times, and wonder if anyone can hear the difference between your public voice and your private one. The answer, unfortunately, is yes, but only the people who already know where to listen. Later, Alone again for a blessed stretch of time, you let your shoulders drop. This marriage, you admit, is a structure built to last, not to comfort. It exists to produce heirs, prevent wars, and look good in chronicles. Your role within it is clearly defined, and deviation is noticed immediately. You were taught that sacrifice was a virtue, especially for women with crowns, and you internalize that lesson so thoroughly that it now argues with your heartbeat. You think back to the wedding night, which history prefers to romanticize. The truth was quieter, stranger, full of nerves and expectations, pressing down on both of you like extra blankets. You did your duty then, too, because that's what you were trained to do, and you learned quickly how to separate body from feeling. This is not something they mention in portraits. Another light joke floats through your mind because humor is how you survive. If emotional compartmentalization earned medals, queens would sweep the podium every time. The day continues in fragments, audiences, meals eaten under watchful eyes, conversations that never quite say anything. But underneath it all, your confession from the night before hums steadily. You realize that loving someone else doesn't erase the marriage, it complicates it, stretches it thin in places it was never meant to bend. That realization sits heavy like a book you're afraid to open, because you already know how it ends. As evening approaches, you return once more to your rooms, carrying the weight of a union built by counsel rather than choice. You understand now that this marriage is the foundation upon which everything else rests, including your forbidden love. You did not choose the structure, but you must live inside it, navigating its narrow corridors with care. The crown demands it, history expects it, and tomorrow will pretend nothing is wrong. But tonight, as the light fades again, you know the truth. Duty may have claimed your hand, but it never quite convinced your heart. You remember the exact moment protocol cracked, not loudly, not with a scandalous bang, but with a sound so small only you noticed it. A glance, that's all. In a hall built to impress foreign envoys and intimidate lesser nobles, you lifted your eyes at precisely the wrong second and met someone else's. This is how history's most inconvenient stories often begin, with something easily dismissed afterward by everyone except the two people involved. The room smelled of polished wood and ambition, and your expression was meant to be neutral, ceremonial, forgettable. Instead, it lingered. This was a court where every movement was regulated, where who stood where mattered almost as much as what was said. Mainstream historical fact. Royal courts operated on rigid hierarchies, and even eye contact could signal favor or offense, depending on context. You knew this. You had been trained in it, and yet your eyes betrayed you before your mind could intervene. For half a heartbeat, the world narrowed to a single human presence. And in that narrowing, something irreversible happened. You tell yourself now that it could have meant nothing. Perhaps it was curiosity or boredom or the universal human instinct to look at the one person not staring at the crown. Historians still argue whether such moments can truly change the course of lives, or whether we simply assign meaning to them later because the story demands a starting point. You suspect the truth is annoyingly poetic. The meaning arrives afterward, but the damage is immediate. From that day on, you notice patterns you had previously ignored. Where that person stands during ceremonies, how they tilt their head when listening, the cadence of their voice, distinct amid the murmur of courtly noise. You become, to your own horror, observant. This is inconvenient because observation leads to imagination, and imagination is where trouble sets up permanent residence. You mentally scold yourself the way you would a disobedient child, except the child in question is your own heart, and it does not respond well to discipline. There is something almost comical about how careful you try to be afterward. You avoid corridors, adjust schedules, suddenly develop a deep interest in staring at tapestries whenever they enter a room. Light joke number 1. If avoidance were an Olympic sport, you'd still lose to fate, which apparently trained harder. The palace seems determined to funnel you into shared spaces, like an elaborate social experiment designed to test your self-control. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your thoughts as you pace your chamber one afternoon. Court etiquette manuals existed not just to enforce behavior, but to prevent exactly this kind of emotional entanglement. They warned against familiarity, private jokes, prolonged conversations. The irony, of course, is that rules tend to highlight the very things they forbid, like putting a neon sign over temptation and asking everyone to ignore it. You had memorized those manuals. They did not account for the electricity of recognition. What unsettles you most is not desire, but recognition. The sense that this person sees you as something other than a symbol or a strategic asset. When you speak, they listen as if your words are not pre-approved by counsel. It is intoxicating in a quiet, almost responsible way, which is frankly the most dangerous kind. You begin to look forward to court gatherings you once endured, and that alone feels like a betrayal. At night, you replay the glance again, noticing new details each time. The slight lift of an eyebrow, the shared flicker of surprise. You wonder if they remember it the way you do, or if this is a solo spiral you're conducting for one. Historians still argue whether love requires mutual awareness at its inception, or whether one-sided awakenings can shape events just as powerfully. You'd love a definitive answer, but history rarely provides those in real time. The weeks pass, and the glance becomes a memory layered with meaning. It is no longer just an accident. It is a reference point. Everything before it feels duller, everything after more charged. You haven't touched, confessed, or even spoken improperly, and yet you feel as though you've crossed a line drawn in invisible ink. The crown feels heavier, the room's smaller. You realize now that protocol didn't truly break in that hall. It bent, quietly, accommodating something human inside a system that pretended humanity was optional. And once bent, it will never quite return to its original shape. You smooth your expression before the mirror, practicing composure like a spell, and head back into the palace, knowing that a single glance has already rewritten the map of your inner world. You learn quickly that glances are unsustainable. They burn too brightly, invite too much interpretation, and leave you no place to hide. Words, on the other hand, can be folded, concealed, tucked away like contraband. It begins with ink and paper, two things that feel harmless until they aren't. You don't decide to write a letter so much as you find yourself holding a pen long after you were supposed to put it down, staring at a blank page as if it has challenged you personally. Mainstream historical fact, literacy among queens was not just common, but politically useful, and letters were the bloodstream of early modern courts. You were trained to write carefully, formally, with just enough warmth to reassure, and just enough distance to protect. What you were not trained for was how to write when your heart is involved. The first letter is nothing, polite, safe. It could be shown to anyone and mean nothing. That's the problem. It means something to you. You hide it where no one would think to look, inside a prayer book worn soft at the edges. Quirky tidbit. This was not uncommon. Books, especially religious ones, were considered almost invisible storage because who would suspect scandal tucked beside a psalm? You tell yourself this is clever. You do not tell yourself this is reckless. There's a difference, and it matters for your sleep. When the reply comes, your pulse betrays you before your face does. You recognize the hand instantly, even though you've seen it only in official contexts before. The words mirror yours in restraint, dancing carefully around what cannot be said. This is how you begin a new skill, reading between lines so narrow they barely exist. Historians still argue whether such coded correspondence was truly secret or merely plausible deniability dressed as discretion. You suspect it was both, depending on who was doing the reading. The letters become a rhythm, not frequent enough to attract attention, not rare enough to starve the feeling. You learn which phrases signal longing and which mean caution. You learn that absence sharpens thought in ways presence never could. And there's a light joke in this realization too. If yearning burned calories, you'd be the healthiest monarch in Europe. Instead, it burns patience, which is much harder to replace. You grow adept at the rituals of concealment. You memorize the order in which your attendants clean your rooms. You learn which maid is incurious and which one notices everything. This is the unromantic labor of forbidden love, a series of small logistical triumphs that never make it into ballads. The prayer book grows thicker with meaning, heavier than its binding should allow. What surprises you is how the letters change you. You speak more carefully in public, knowing your real voice exists elsewhere. You begin to feel as though you are living two lives, one embroidered in gold, one written in ink. The second feels truer, which is alarming given how few people know it exists. Historians still argue whether secrecy intensifies emotion or simply reveals it, and you are in no position to conduct a controlled study. One evening, as you seal another letter, you hesitate. This is a moment you recognize later as important. You wonder briefly what would happen if the book were discovered, if the words were read aloud by hostile mouths. The thought sends a chill through you, but it does not stop your hand. That, you realize, is the confession within the confession. You are willing to risk something now. You slide the letter into its place and close the book gently, as if not to wake it. Outside, the palace settles into night, unaware that a second, quieter narrative is unfolding in its margins. You lie down with ink-stained fingers and feel a strange calm. Love has found a language, and language once released is very difficult to silence. You start hearing your name in rooms you haven't entered yet, carried on voices that lower when you approach and rise again the moment you pass. This is how you know the rumors have begun. Court gossip has a particular texture, soft, persistent, impossible to grasp and impossible to escape. Mainstream historical fact. Royal courts thrived on rumor as an informal information network, often more efficient than official reports. You were raised inside it, so you recognize the shift immediately. At first, the whispers are vague, almost flattering. You are said to be distant, thoughtful, changed. People love a mystery as long as it doesn't inconvenience them. But gossip matures quickly, like fruit left too long in the sun. It develops spots. You notice people watching your interactions more closely, counting glances, measuring pauses. Every smile becomes evidence. You begin to understand how exhausting it must be to be your own scandal. You adjust, of course. Queens are excellent at adjusting. You laugh louder in public, linger longer with your husband, perform normality with theatrical enthusiasm. Like joke number one, if overcompensating were visible, you'd glow like a chandelier. It almost works. Almost is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The palace itself seems to participate in the whispering. Corridors feel narrower, tapestries more attentive. A quirky tidbit slips into your thoughts. Some courts employed official listeners, servants whose job was to overhear and report conversations. Whether this was formalized or simply understood is still debated, but the effect is the same. You assume the walls have ears and possibly opinions. You become hyper-aware of patterns, who arrives late to dinners, who leaves early, who suddenly finds reasons to be near you and who avoids you entirely. Historians still argue whether queens were ever truly ignorant of court rumour, or whether they pretended not to hear as a survival tactic. You suspect it's the latter. Acknowledging gossip gives it power, ignoring it gives you plausible deniability and a headache. The letters continue, though more cautiously now. The tone shifts, not cooler but sharper, as if both of you sense the tightening net. You write about weather, about books, about things that mean nothing and everything. The prayer book remains your accomplice, but you find yourself checking its hiding place twice instead of once. Sleep becomes lighter, filled with half-dreams where names are spoken aloud. One afternoon, you catch a look, not the look from before, but a different one, measuring, speculative. It belongs to someone who understands the game. You feel it land like a hand on your shoulder, not heavy, just present. This is the moment you realize rumors don't need proof. They only need interest. And interest, once sparked, spreads faster than truth. You consider ending it. This is the responsible thought, the one you were trained to have, and you imagine the relief of returning to a single life, a single script. Historians still argue whether queens truly had the power to stop scandals once they began, or whether momentum always favored exposure. You suspect stopping now would hurt more than continuing, and that knowledge frightens you. As night falls, you retreat once more to your rooms, carrying the weight of unseen eyes. You sit by the window and listen to the palace settle, the sounds of doors closing and guards changing shifts. Love, you realize, is no longer just between two people. It has become a social event, a whispered story with a life of its own. And once a story starts walking on its own feet, even a queen cannot easily call it back. You kneel because that is what you are supposed to do. The stone beneath your knees is cold, intentionally so. A reminder that comfort is not the point of confession. The confessor sits just beyond the lattice, his silhouette softened by candlelight, and for a moment you consider how absurd this is, a queen reduced to a voice and a shadow, whispering sins into a wooden screen. Mainstream historical fact. Royal confessors often held immense influence, serving as spiritual advisors and informal political counselors, whether anyone admitted it or not. You chose him carefully, which is to say, you chose the least dangerous option available. You begin with safe things, impatience, pride, thoughts that wander during prayer, the classics. Your voice is steady, practiced, almost bored. Then there is a pause, longer than necessary, and you feel the weight of what you have not said pressing forward. Confession, you realize, is a slippery slope. Once you start telling the truth, it becomes increasingly difficult to stop at the convenient parts. When you finally speak of love, you do it indirectly, as if approaching a wild animal. You say attachment, you say distraction, you do not say a name. You do not need to. The silence on the other side of the screen deepens, thickens. Historians still argue whether confessors truly kept royal secrets or quietly shared them when it suited larger interests. You try not to think about that as you wait for his response. He speaks gently, which is both reassuring and alarming. He reminds you of duty, of vows, of the danger of indulgence. He does not ask questions. That, you note, is a choice. A quirky tidbit drifts through your mind despite the tension. Some confessors kept coded notebooks of royal sins written in personal shorthand. The idea makes your stomach tighten, though you tell yourself that's just imagination, being unhelpful again. You leave the chapel lighter and heavier at the same time, which feels like an achievement. You have said something true without fully exposing yourself, a balancing act you've perfected over years. Still, the knowledge that another human now knows, really knows, changes the shape of the risk. Love has acquired an audience of one more, and you don't know whether that makes it safer or more fragile. The confessor watches you differently afterward, not obviously, nothing you could point to. Just a slight pause before speaking. a longer look than necessary. You respond by being impeccable. You attend services, donate generously, embody penitence so convincingly that even you almost believe it. Light joke number 1. If holiness were a performance, you'd be up for a Lifetime Achievement Award. Privately, though, the questions multiply. Did he hear what you meant, or only what you said? Is discretion part of his virtue, or is silence merely a delay? Historians still argue whether spiritual authority restrained or empowered queens, and you find yourself living inside that question rather than reading about it centuries later. You notice that the letters change again. There is concern now, careful phrasing that asks without asking. You want to reassure, but reassurance itself feels dangerous. Instead, you write about patience, about trust, about storms passing. You sound wise, which is irritating given how little control you actually feel you have. At night, you dream of lattices and screens, of voices without faces. You wake with the sense of being overheard even in sleep. And yet there is also a strange relief in having spoken aloud, however obliquely. Confession, incomplete though it was, has acknowledged the truth's existence. It no longer lives only in you. As days pass, you understand that the confessor now stands at the intersection of your faith and your fear. He could be a shield or a blade, and you will not know which until it is far too late. You move through the palace with renewed caution, aware that love has acquired not just witnesses but judges, and still, despite everything, you do not regret speaking. Silence, you realize, was becoming its own kind of sin. Word count 1204. Awaiting continue. Continue. Section 7. You discover that jealousy wears surprisingly good jewelry. It smiles, bows, and glides through rooms with impeccable posture, never raising its voice or breaking protocol. You catch it in yourself during ceremonies, coiled beneath layers of silk and restraint, tightening whenever attention drifts where you wish it wouldn't. Mainstream historical fact. Royal courts were pressure cookers of rivalry, where personal emotions and political competition fed off each other relentlessly. You were trained to recognize threats, just not the emotional kind. It begins subtly. A laugh shared across the room that you were not part of. A conversation that ends just as you approach. None of this is improper, which makes it worse. You tell yourself this is childish, unbecoming, absurd for someone who commands armies by proxy. And yet your chest reacts before your reason can intervene. That old betrayal of flesh over logic. Historians still argue whether jealousy is a byproduct of possession or vulnerability, and you feel uncomfortably exposed by the question. You compensate by being gracious. Extra gracious. You compliment gowns, inquire after families, perform warmth like a seasoned actor. Light joke number 1. If politeness were a weapon, you'd have cleared the room already. Instead, it only sharpens the contrast between what you show and what you feel. Jealousy thrives in that gap, stretching itself out, getting comfortable. A quirky tidbit flits through your mind during one particularly long banquet. Some queens reportedly used scented pomanders not just for hygiene, but to steady their nerves during stressful public events. You keep yours close now, inhaling cloves and citrus, as if they might soothe the sharp edge of comparison. They help a little, not enough. You realize jealousy isn't just about fear of loss, it's about powerlessness. You cannot claim, confront, or clarify. Everything must be done sideways, through inference and restraint. You watch interactions the way generals watch borders, scanning for incursions, telling yourself this vigilance is temporary. Historians still argue whether emotional restraint strengthened or hollowed royal women, and you feel both outcomes wrestling inside you. There's a moment, brief but vivid, when jealousy nearly escapes. A comment lands wrong. A smile lingers too long. You feel the impulse rise hot and immediate to assert something, anything. Instead, you sip your drink and let the moment pass. The restraint costs you more than the outburst ever would have, but it preserves the illusion of control, which is the currency of your position. Later alone, you allow yourself a private grimace. This was not part of the fantasy. Love you were promised by stories was supposed to feel expansive, liberating. No one mentioned how much of it would involve standing still while your thoughts run laps. You laugh softly at yourself because humor remains your most reliable ally. Light joke number 2. Falling in love as a queen is like playing chess while everyone else gets to flip the board whenever they want. You write a letter that night you never send. It is sharp, honest, unfiltered. It accuses, admits, reveals too much. You read it once, then fold it away, understanding that some truths are too volatile for ink. Historians still argue whether unsent letters shaped history as much as delivered ones, and you suspect the answer is yes, just invisibly. As days go on, jealousy settles into a low hum, not constant but always ready. You learn to live with it, to incorporate it into your internal landscape like a difficult piece of furniture you can't remove. It teaches you something uncomfortable, how deeply you care and how little control you truly have. You smooth your expression before the mirror once more, jewels catching the light, and step back into public view. Jealousy follows, well-behaved and silent, a reminder that love has teeth even when it never bites. The child arrives the way history prefers its turning points, quietly, wrapped in ceremony, announced with controlled joy. Bells ring, proclamations are drafted, and your body becomes public property all over again. Mainstream historical fact, the birth of a royal child was a political event, witnessed, documented, and debated to ensure legitimacy. You smile through exhaustion while courtiers count weeks and calculate dates with an enthusiasm that would be flattering if it weren't terrifying. You hold the infant and feel something soften in you that nothing else ever quite managed. This is love, without strategy, without consequence, or so you want to believe. The weight is real, grounding, and for a moment the palace recedes. Then the questions arrive, not spoken aloud at first, but present in the way people look, just a fraction too long. You know this look. You have lived inside it. The child's face becomes a canvas for speculation. Whose nose, whose eyes, whose temperament? You listen as if detached, nodding thoughtfully while your chest tightens. Historians still argue whether physical resemblance truly influenced succession debates or merely provided convenient language for existing rivalries. You suspect resemblance is just the excuse. Power is always the real concern. You become careful in ways you hadn't anticipated. How you hold the child. Who is present? Which attendants are allowed close? A quirky tidbit flickers through your mind during one long afternoon. Some royal mothers reportedly altered nursery staffing to control rumour flow, an early form of information management disguised as maternal fussiness. You adopt this strategy without admitting it to yourself. You call it protection. The letters change again. They must. You write less, say more in fewer words. The stakes have shifted and everyone feels it. Love now exists in the shadow of something far more fragile. You don't write about the child directly, but the absence hums loudly between lines. Historians still argue whether the presence of heirs intensified or extinguished forbidden romances, and you wish briefly that someone else could run the experiment. Publicly, you embody serene motherhood. You attend ceremonies, accept congratulations, play your role with a grace that earns admiration. Light joke number 1, if sleep deprivation were visible, you'd be the most honest portrait in the gallery. Privately, you listen for footsteps in corridors, for changes in tone, for the faint shift that signals a narrative forming without your consent. At night, You watch the child breathe and think about how stories are written onto people before they can speak. You promise yourself you will not let this one be consumed by whispers. You promise many things quietly, knowing how often promises bend under pressure. Historians still argue whether royal mothers could truly shield their children from political currents, and you feel the weight of that doubt settle heavily. There is a moment, inevitable, dreaded, when someone says it aloud, not as an accusation, but as a question carefully wrapped in concern. It happens in a private room, with soft voices and sympathetic expressions. You respond with calm, practiced outrage, and the conversation ends as politely as it began. You do not shake until later, when you are alone. The realization lands slowly but firmly. Love has consequences that reach far beyond you now. It touches lineage, legitimacy, and lives that did not ask to be involved. You sit with this truth longer than you want to, letting it settle into something like resolve. This is the cost that stories rarely dwell on, the part where romance intersects with inheritance, law, and everyone loses sleep. As you return to your chambers, child cradled close, you feel the boundaries of your world tighten. Love remains, stubborn and real, but it now shares space with fear, sharpened by responsibility. You move forward carefully because there is no other direction available, and somewhere deep inside you begin to understand that history's harshest judgments often fall not on lovers but on their children. You notice the foreigners before you notice the threat, which is usually how it happens. Their smiles are a fraction too measured, their interest a shade too attentive. Ambassadors have always watched you, of course, but this feels different. Mainstream historical fact. Foreign envoys routinely reported on the personal lives of monarchs, understanding that private weakness could become public leverage. You have read enough intercepted correspondence to know how easily affection turns into ammunition. They ask polite questions about your health, your happiness, your child. Nothing improper, nothing accidental. You answer with the practiced warmth of someone who knows every word may be copied later by an unseen hand. Historians still argue whether queens were fully aware of the intelligence games played around them, or whether awareness itself became another layer of performance. You are aware enough to feel the chill beneath the civility. The realization settles in slowly. Your love is no longer just a rumor. It is a potential bargaining chip. Someone, somewhere, is deciding how useful it might be. You imagine your private letters reduced to summaries, your glances transformed into bullet points. Light joke number 1, because you need it. If emotional vulnerability paid taxes, you'd finally balance the budget. The humor is thin, but it keeps panic at bay. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen to an envoy praise your court's hospitality. Some diplomats carried invisible inks or coded alphabets, turning seemingly harmless reports into layered confessions. You suddenly wonder how many truths have already been written about you in languages you cannot read. The thought makes your shoulders tense beneath their finery. You adjust your behavior again, becoming even more careful than before. You limit appearances. You shorten conversations. You let others speak for you whenever possible. Historians still argue whether restraint protected queens from exploitation or merely confirmed suspicions, and you find yourself caught between those interpretations, living proof of both. The letters slow, then pause. This is not a decision so much as a mutual understanding shaped by fear. Silence, once oppressive, now feels strategic. You miss the words more than you expected, and that absence aches in a way that feels almost physical. You remind yourself that distance can be an act of care, even if it feels like punishment. There is a moment of directness, brief and unsettling, when an ambassador just hints, that reputations travel faster than armies. You respond with regal confusion, letting the implications slide off polished composure. Inside, something hardens. You understand now that the game has escalated. Love has crossed borders without a passport. At night, you review conversations like battle plans, searching for weaknesses. You think about how easily a single suggestion could become a formal complaint, how quickly whispers could acquire seals and signatures. Historians still argue whether foreign interference amplified court scandals or merely exposed what was already unstable. You suspect exposure is its own form of creation. You stand by the window looking out at darkened grounds and feel the strange loneliness of power. Everyone around you wants something, and now they know you want something too. That knowledge shifts the balance in ways you cannot fully calculate. As you turn away from the glass, you make a quiet decision. You will survive this not by retreating entirely, but by choosing carefully which truths you allow the world to see. Love may be forbidden, but it is not defenseless. You carry it forward, guarded now not just by secrecy, but by strategy. Faith has always been a structure in your life, solid and immovable, like the stone walls of the palace itself. Now it feels less like shelter and more like a narrow bridge you must cross in the dark. You light candles at night and kneel out of habit as much as belief, feeling the weight of promises made aloud and broken quietly. Mainstream historical fact: queens were expected to model public piety, their devotion treated as both moral example and political reassurance. You have played this role flawlessly for years. Now it plays you back. You begin bargaining in small, private ways. If you are faithful in one sense, perhaps you may be forgiven in another. If you give generously, pray fervently, deny yourself publicly, perhaps desire will loosen its grip. Historians still argue whether religious devotion soothed forbidden love or sharpened its edges, and you feel both effects working at once, like opposing tides pulling at the same shore. Midnight becomes your hour. The palace sleeps, guards shift, and you whisper vows meant for no audience but the dark. You promise restraint, you promise patience, you promise things you are not entirely sure you can keep. Like joke number 1, barely a smile in the gloom. If broken promises echoed, the chapel would never be quiet again. The humour fades quickly, leaving sincerity behind. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts as you trace the edge of a prayer book. Some monarchs believed nighttime prayers were more powerful, closer to God because fewer distractions stood in the way. You cling to this idea not because you know it's true, but because you need it to be. Faith becomes less about doctrine and more about endurance. Guilt settles differently now. It no longer arrives in sharp bursts. It lingers, a low ache beneath everything else. You feel it during meals, during laughter, during moments of genuine joy with your child. Historians still argue whether guilt restrained queens from action or merely taught them to live with contradiction. You suspect guilt is less a barrier than a companion, one that walks beside you whether invited or not. You consider confession again and dismiss it just as quickly. Words once spoken cannot be retrieved. You have learned how fragile containment can be. Instead, you redirect devotion into ritual, more services, longer fasts, public acts of humility that satisfy expectations while quietly punishing yourself. You become, in essence, your own disciplinarian. There is a moment of clarity, brief and unsettling, when you realize faith has not condemned your love outright. It has complicated it, yes, but it has also given it language, sacrifice, suffering, devotion. You don't know whether this reframing is dangerous or necessary. Historians still argue whether religious frameworks legitimized forbidden relationships or merely masked them in virtue. You live inside that argument now, day after day. One night, exhaustion overtakes you mid-prayer. Your head bows, not in reverence but in fatigue, and you almost laugh at the symbolism. Light joke number 2, apparently even spiritual crises respect bedtime. You rise stiffly, joints aching, and feel very human despite the crown waiting nearby. As dawn approaches, you understand that faith will not rescue you from choice. It will not decide for you. It will only stand witness as you navigate love, duty, and consequence. You accept this with a quiet steadiness that surprises you. Midnight vows fade with the light, but the resolve remains. You move into the coming days knowing belief will not erase desire, nor will desire erase belief. They will coexist, uneasy but inseparable, shaping every decision from here on. And for the first time in a while, you stop asking forgiveness in advance and start asking for strength instead. Summer arrives with its usual insistence, dragging heat and expectation through the palace gates. This is the season of entertainments, of elaborate diversions designed to prove stability, wealth, and delight all at once. You attend the masque because absence would be noticed, and noticing is what you are trying to manage. Mainstream historical fact: court masques were not just performances but political theatre, carefully choreographed displays of hierarchy and favour. Tonight, hierarchy wears velvet and symbolism wears a smile. You are masked, finally anonymous in a way the crown rarely allows. The fabric rests lightly against your skin, and for a moment you feel like a person rather than a position. This anonymity is an illusion, of course. Everyone knows who you are, but illusion has power when everyone agrees to maintain it. Historians still argue whether such performances offered genuine release or merely reinforced control. You step into the role and decide to find out. Music swells, and bodies move in patterns older than any of the people dancing them. The room glows with candlelight and heat, the air thick with perfume and anticipation. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you circle the floor. Some masks allowed carefully scripted chance encounters, moments where masked participants could speak more freely without formal consequence. You wonder who first thought that was a good idea. You silently thank them and immediately regret it. You meet them there, inevitable as gravity. The mask changes nothing and everything. You recognize each other by posture, by the way attention settles instinctively. Words are unnecessary at first. When they come, they are careful, light, disguised as commentary on the music, the heat, the absurdity of dancing while pretending not to sweat. Light joke number 1. Nothing tests royal dignity like humidity and choreography. The humor is shared, quiet, and dangerous. For a brief stretch of time, the world simplifies. There is movement, sound, and proximity without consequence. You are not queen and subject, not risk and rumour, just two figures orbiting each other within agreed boundaries. Historians still argue whether such moments of liminality altered relationships or merely intensified longing afterward. You suspect both outcomes are correct and cruel. The dance ends too soon. It always does. You separate smoothly, as trained, slipping back into roles like well-worn gloves. The mask comes off, and with it, the fragile freedom. The room sharpens, edges reappearing. You feel the absence immediately, like stepping from warm water into cool air. Later, seated and observing, you replay the encounter with a precision that borders on obsession. Nothing improper occurred. That somehow makes it harder. The restraint required to maintain appearances has become a shared language, intimate in its own way. Historians still argue whether restraint deepened emotional bonds more than indulgence ever could. You feel the truth of that debate settle heavily. As the evening winds down, you notice how carefully everyone disperses, how the spectacle dissolves without leaving traces. The mask has done its job, entertained, distracted, reassured. It has also reminded you how thin the line is between concealment and exposure. You return to your chambers flushed, not entirely, from the heat. The mask rests on a table, empty now, and you regard it with mixed gratitude and resentment. It allowed you a glimpse of something lighter, freer, and it took it away just as cleanly. As you prepare for sleep, you accept a quiet truth. Anonymity, however brief, can be intoxicating, but it is not a solution. Love revealed in shadows still shapes the light. You extinguish the candles one by one, carrying the memory of movement and music with you, knowing the dance has changed nothing and everything at once. The word they use is mercy, which immediately tells you it isn't. It arrives dressed in gentleness, wrapped in concern for your well-being, your reputation, the stability of the realm. You listen as plans are outlined with soft voices and sympathetic expressions, and you recognize the shape of exile even before it is named. Mainstream historical fact. Banishment at court was often framed as protection or honor, a way to remove risk without admitting punishment. You nod slowly because nodding costs less than arguing. They speak of rest, of distance, of how a change of scenery might ease the strain you've been under. Historians still argue whether such removals were acts of compassion or quiet control, and you sit there, living the ambiguity, crown balanced carefully atop your composure. You are not accused, you are not condemned, you are simply redirected. The destination is pleasant enough, a residence far from the sharp-eyed density of court. You've been there before, briefly on progress, admired its gardens and wide skies. Now those same features feel like insulation. A buffer? You accept because refusal would only sharpen interest, and you have learned how dangerous interest can be. Light joke number 1, bitter but necessary. If being sent away solved everything, history would be much shorter. Packing is an exercise in omission. You choose what can be seen and leave behind what cannot. Letters are burned, their words released into smoke that curls and vanishes without testimony. This hurts more than you expected, watching meaning dissolve into ash. A quirky tidbit intrudes, despite your grief. Some queens kept decoy papers precisely for moments like this, documents meant to be found so others would stop looking. You wonder who first perfected that particular heartbreak. The journey itself is quiet, no fanfare, no crowds, just the rhythm of wheels and hooves and the slow widening of space around you. Historians still argue whether distance cooled forbidden relationships or preserved them in idealized form. You don't know which outcome frightens you more. At the residence, days stretch differently. There are fewer eyes, fewer interruptions, fewer performances. You breathe more deeply without realizing you had been holding your breath for years. And yet the absence is loud. Every room echoes with what is not there. You fill time with routine, with walks, with attention to your child, whose presence anchors you more firmly than anything else ever has. You think often about whether this banishment has saved lives or ruined them. Yours, certainly, in some fashion. Others, perhaps, spared from scandal or conflict. Historians still argue whether removing queens from court reduced instability or merely displaced it, and you suspect displacement is just another form of postponement. There is a strange dignity in survival. You discover this slowly as weeks turn into months. You are still queen, still bound by duty, but the sharpest edges have been filed down by distance. Love remains, quieter now, less immediate, but no less real. It has adapted, as you have, to narrower spaces. As you settle into this altered life, you understand the true nature of the mercy offered. It was not kindness, it was compromise. A way for the world to keep turning without forcing anyone to admit how close it came to breaking. You accept this with a steadiness that surprises you, because acceptance, too, can be a form of power. The drums reach you before the messengers do, not literally, but in the way tension always arrives ahead of explanation. Letters grow shorter, voices tighter, silences heavier. War has a sound even at a distance, and you recognize it from childhood lessons delivered over maps and finger-pointing advisors. Mainstream historical fact: queens, even when removed from court, were deeply entangled in wartime politics, their marriages and reputations used to justify alliances or aggression. You may be far away, but you are not irrelevant. The news comes in fragments. A border dispute flares, an old treaty phrase. Names you recognize surface in unfamiliar combinations. You listen carefully because listening is one of the few powers left to you. Historians still argue whether queens in semi-exile influenced war through quiet counsel or whether their voices were deliberately minimized. You suspect minimization works only until someone needs a symbol, and symbols, unfortunately, travel well. You think about love in wartime, how absurd and fragile it feels against the backdrop of marching armies, and yet it persists. You measure devotion now not in words or glances, but in restraint, in the decision not to write, in the choice not to ask questions that could endanger others. Light joke number 1, dry and brief. Nothing kills romance like logistics except maybe artillery. You don't laugh long. A quirky tidbit drifts in during one long evening by the fire. Some queens kept parallel correspondence during wars, one set official, one deeply personal, each carefully timed to avoid interception. You imagine the precision required, the nerve, and feel a quiet kinship with those long-gone hands guiding ink across paper. You choose caution instead. Courage wears many disguises. You are asked for advice, not formally, not publicly, but through trusted channels that still exist despite distance. What will your family tolerate? What will the people believe? You answer carefully, framing every suggestion in the language of stability. Historians still argue whether such counsel meaningfully shaped outcomes or merely eased consciences. You offer it anyway, because offering something feels better than offering nothing. There is a moment when love is tested explicitly. A choice implied but never stated. Support this course and protect one life, or oppose it and protect many. You recognize the cruelty of the framing immediately. War loves false binaries. You take time more than they want because haste has never favored the careful. When you respond, you do so in terms of duty, knowing exactly what you are sacrificing by doing so. The sacrifice settles slowly. You feel it in the way mornings feel heavier, in the way memory sharpens instead of fading. Historians still argue whether choosing the realm over the heart was an act of strength or surrender. You decide labels are for observers. Living is more complicated. As reports continue to arrive, you watch the conflict unfold like a distant storm, knowing some of the lightning is yours. You attend prayers, offer alms, and hold your child close, grounding yourself in what remains tangible. Love, you learn, does not disappear under pressure. It changes shape, becoming quieter, harder, and far more expensive. When the drums finally fade into uneasy silence, you remain where you are, altered but standing. War has tested your devotion and found it wanting, or perhaps found it mature. The difference depends on who is telling the story. You sit with the ambiguity and discover you can survive it. That too is a kind of victory. Time thins the noise, not all at once, not cleanly, but enough that you begin to hear your own thoughts again without them being immediately drowned out by expectation. This is when you realize it's time to decide what survives you. Not what survives the court, or the treaties, or the gossip, but what survives you. Mainstream historical fact. Queens were acutely aware of legacy, often shaping archives, portraits, and narratives long before their deaths. Memory, like power, benefits from early management. You begin sorting without calling it that. Which letters remain burned? Which names are never spoken again? Which stories you tell your child when no one else is listening? Historians still argue whether queens actively edited their own histories or merely responded to pressures already in motion. You know the answer, at least for yourself. Silence is also an edit. There are moments of temptation when you consider preserving everything, letting future centuries untangle the truth on their own. It feels almost romantic, this idea of raw honesty surviving intact. Then you imagine what honesty costs when it has no context, no mercy, no living voice to soften it. You choose restraint instead. Light joke, number 1, gentle and tired. History students do not need more emotional homework than they already have. A quirky tidbit returns to you as you review old objects. Some queens dictated testamentary confessions, private documents meant to be destroyed unread, symbolic acts of release rather than revelation. You understand the impulse deeply. Letting go, you discover, is its own form of authorship. You allow a few truths to remain, disguised but present. Not enough to scandalize, not enough to lie, just enough to suggest that you are human, complicated, capable of feeling beyond your assigned role. Historians still argue whether ambiguity protects reputations or erodes them. You suspect ambiguity is simply honest when certainty would be false. You think about love one last time without flinching, not as a wound, not as a rebellion, but as a fact. It existed. It shaped you. It did not destroy the realm, nor did it save it. It made you quieter, sharper, more aware of cost. That seems legacy enough. As years pass, people speak of you with admiration, tinged by mystery. You are praised for restraint, for dignity, for surviving difficult seasons. They do not speak of what you gave up to achieve that balance. Historians still argue whether absence in the record implies innocence or erasure. You let them argue. You walk the gardens more slowly now, feeling the ground beneath your feet with deliberate care. You have outlived the sharpest judgments. What remains is a steady presence, a woman who learned how to carry truth without displaying it. When night comes, you sleep without rehearsing defenses. The confessions are done, the choosing is done. What survives you will be incomplete, but so is every human story. You accept that with a calm that feels earned. And for the first time in a long while, you do not wonder how history will judge you. You already know how you judge yourself. You feel it before you name it, the closing of a long interior door, not slammed, not locked, just eased, shut with deliberate care. This is the final confession, though it does not feel dramatic. It feels settled, mainstream historical fact. Many queens spent their later years reflecting privately on choices that public records never captured, shaping meaning internally rather than politically. You understand now why. Closure is not something the world grants. It's something you practice. You no longer burn letters because there are none left to destroy. What mattered has already been carried as far as it could go. Love has softened into memory, and memory into influence. Quiet, shaping how you respond rather than what you reach for. Historians still argue whether time diminishes forbidden love or preserves it in ideal form. You suspect it does neither. It transforms it into something usable. You sit often with your child, listening more than speaking. You teach without teaching, modeling restraint, curiosity, kindness. You do not warn them about love, you show them how to live with consequence. Like joke number 1, barely there. If wisdom arrived earlier, entire dynasties would look very different. Still, you are grateful it arrived at all. A quirky tidbit drifts through your thoughts as you arrange personal effects. Some queens kept a single object from their most dangerous years, not as nostalgia, but as reminder. You keep nothing visible. The reminder lives in you now, steadier than any artifact. Visitors still come, deferential, respectful. They see a queen shaped by experience and call it grace. They do not know the cost of that shape, and you no longer need them to. Historians still argue whether dignity is innate or constructed under pressure. You smile at the question and let it remain unanswered. In quiet moments, you revisit the path without regret. Not because it was painless, but because regret implies an alternative self untouched by reality. You were this person, in this time, making the best choices you could with imperfect knowledge. That feels honest enough to rest with. As the years settle gently around you, the palace becomes background rather than burden. Sound softens. Light lingers longer. You breathe more slowly. The crown still exists, but it no longer presses into your thoughts at night. Now the pacing slows. Words stretch. The air feels heavier, calmer. You are safe. The story has no more sharp turns, only quiet continuation. You let the final images fade, the silk curtains, the masked dance, the burned letters, until they blur into warmth. You lie back into stillness, knowing nothing more is demanded of you tonight.